Hi, everybody. My name is Azek Garcia, and as a bilingual individual, communication and language is super important to me. That's why I decided to focus on how being bilingual has an effect and plays a role on shaping cognitive development. I decided to use the research articles Bilingual Effects on Cognitive and Linguistic Development, Role of Language, Cultural Background, and Education, as well as the research article The Effects of Habitual Code Switching and Bilingual Language Production on Cognitive Control in order to see how bilingualism actually shapes cognitive development. So, for this first article, researchers actually wanted to measure and answer the questions of what effect of bilingual code switching and language proficiency have on cognitive shifting, and how does frequent code switching lead to better language task switching and nonverbal cognitive control. But they also want to emphasize how does language, culture, and language instruction affect verbal and nonverbal tasks. They decided to move forward this based on previous research that showed that bilingual children actually have faster and more accurate nonverbal tasks. Because of this research, they also found out that bilingual research should consider cultural influences because culture does matter for cognitive skills. They decided to put together a study that not only finds out information about nonverbal tasks and verbal tasks, but also how culture and these influences that come with it have an effect on cognitive development. They believed that those in the verbal and nonverbal tasks would all almost have the same scores, but they also believe that bilingual groups would perform the same on nonverbal tasks, but those with more related languages, such as French and English and Spanish English bilinguals, would perform better on verbal tasks than those who did not have such similar languages. So this study design consisted of 104 participants who were all 6-year-olds, 26 English monolinguals, so they only spoke English, 30 Chinese English speaking bilinguals, and then 28 French English speaking bilinguals and 20 Spanish English speaking bilinguals. This study consisted of 3 verbal tasks and 1 nonverbal task. These tasks all measured receptive vocabularies, language scores, and morphological knowledge. And those nonverbal tasks included different color switching tasks. And this language similarity was also taken into consideration when reviewing results. For these different tasks, they depended on how much actual knowledge individuals had and the overall performance that they had. And they were measured all within reaction time and accuracy. So we see here that we have all the different tests. So the PPVT test that takes a look at receptive vocabulary, our CLEF test that takes a look at standardized language, and then our WUGS test that takes a look at the morphological knowledge. And with these, we see that in this receptive vocabulary challenge, English monolinguals had the highest score, indicating that they had the strongest English vocabulary. On this CLEF test, we see that English monolinguals again had the highest overall performance, but in this WUGS test, we see that um, Spanish bilinguals actually had a higher score, showing that they had a stronger ability with English morphology. And we see in these scores that the similarity, Spanish and English bilinguals have the most similarity in language, showing that's why they're also the ones that have the most common score, the most not common, but closest scores to those English bilinguals who had the high score. For our nonverbal tasks, this consisted of a color shaping task switching, meaning that individuals were presented with either for example, a red square and had to identify whether it was a square or red. So it just depended on the stimuli that was chosen by the researcher. So for this task, we see that all groups were accurate, but that reaction times were very different. Monolinguals were slower when switching tasks, so switching to saying the color or saying the shape, meaning that it took them longer to adjust to that switch. And then bilinguals were more faster and more efficient, meaning that they had better nonverbal executive functions. For this second study, the researchers really focus on the question of does frequent code switching lead to better performance on cognitive shifting and inhibitory control? Essentially, they were motivated by the ACH and the CPM theories that ultimately showed that using two languages and frequent switching requires different levels of cognitive control. So there are two different systems. And that bilingual individuals' cognitive control adapts depending on how well they use it in how much they use the language in life, and that bilingual people manage cognitive resources differently when switching language. And they really wanted to emphasize that there's a difference within different cognitive demands and that cognitive and language actually overlap. So, researchers hypothesize that bilinguals who spend time in single language places will actually perform worse on both verbal and nonverbal tasks. So, for this study, there were 31 Mandarin English speaking bilinguals. Similar to the other tasks, they were put into verbal and nonverbal tasks, as well as having to go through different switches or speaking a single language or repeated language. The verbal task consisted of a picture naming switching task. So they had to name the picture. And the nonverbal task was the color shaping task, which is the exact same one as the one in the previous study where they had to choose either the shape or the color of something, depending on the stimulus. They were measured they were measured by reaction time and accuracy as well. So for the results here for the verbal tasks, we see that when only we see that the repeated and the switch. So this, for example, would be English, and then this would be English again, and then switch. So it'd be Chinese, or vice versa, Chinese, Chinese, English. Um, when only one language was used, so the singles, we see that pictures were named faster and more accurately. And we also see that when it's mixed, so the switch, there is a slower reaction time and a reduced accuracy, but it's also showing that bilinguals have more adaptability between the switches. For our nonverbal tasks, this is where they had to nonverbally react to the color or the shape of an item. We see that there's slower reaction times when switching between color and shape rules. We also see that people got slower as the task required more mental shifts. So we see here from the single to the switch, there is a very big difference. But overall, we see that language switching and task switching uses similar systems. So overall, for both of these studies, their hypotheses were supported. There's a lot of correlation and meaning between both of these studies, showing that bilingualism boosts executive control, bilinguals actually have more cognitive benefits, and that language switching actually enhances general cognitive control and brain flexibility. We see that for both of these, there is proof that being bilingual helps with thinking and attention skills, especially for switching between tasks. Um, Language performance depended on how similar two languages were, but overall, both studies support the hypotheses and the idea that bilingual experience strengthens cognitive control and development in many different ways. Thank you.